Hi, I'm Brandon Fields, the voice of Private Josh Woods on The Haven Chronicles. You're listening to Sci-Fi Haven.
This is a very special episode of Sci-Fi Haven. In fact, this episode will have nothing to do with any review of a TV show or movie, but this is something that is more of an opening up of myself, so you can learn more about me. I've been very open since I initially recorded this episode back in November of 2020, probably to the point where it probably made me, well actually, I'll be honest, it made me feel like I was being an imposter. Kind of like you'd get in the video game Among Us, but more with how I express myself. I'm sure you've noticed in the way I record my episodes, I don't refer to myself as I very often. I almost always say we. It's something that just who I am. Well, this episode is just a full coming out episode, and I have included clips from my friend Christopher D. Littlefield's podcast, Open Channel Track, episode 19, Black Girl Magic is Real. The reason I mention Chris's podcast will become clear in a few moments, and of course a link to his episode will be included in the show notes for this episode. As we mentioned in the Doctor Who review episode, You're Missing the Big Question, Sally shipped in. I'd recently come out to my best friend Ren that I'm non-binary. I prefer the pronouns they, them. You know, I think about this. I think that's actually the first time I've mentioned my preferred pronouns on my own podcast, because not many people ask. But when I came out to Ren, I also came out to another non-binary individual, my friend Red Sheridan. I didn't come out to anyone else for a while. Maybe 2 or 3 weeks had passed before anybody else knew. Because, like I mentioned, I was worried for the backlash that I got when I came out as bisexual 10 years ago. When I came out as bi, I lost my best friend, who I'd known for 7 years at that point. I knew him all the way back in middle school. And to put into context, I graduated from high school in 2004. It's 2021. So it's been 16 and a half years since I graduated from high school. And then, well, in Alberta, middle school is grades 7, 8, and 9. So that's almost 20 years since I was in high school. Whoa. It's been 20 years since I was in high school. That blows my mind. Anyways, let's get back to my podcast. Well, when I was starting to feel extremely anxious about hiding my true self, I did start a lot of self-doubt. But as a massive Star Trek fan, I'd been watching the series Star Trek Discovery as much as possible. And my friend Chris, who runs the podcast Open Channel Track, which is a comments review style podcast over on Holosuite Media, he was one of the first people that found out that I was non-binary, outside of the two I've already mentioned. In early November of 2020, there was an episode of Star Trek Discovery entitled Forget Me Not, which introduced Star Trek fans to Gray and Adira Tall. Gray Tall is played by the first publicly transgender actor, Ian Alexander. And while my friend Chris had Brittany Tomes, a host of the podcast A Strange New Pod, as a guest on the show. On a side note, we are now sponsoring through Patreon as of today, actually. We're part of the Patreon zone for A Strange New Pod, so that's pretty exciting news. And while I've been contributing to Open Channel Track every single week, but I had missed by literally an hour of Chris and Brittany recording episode 18, Shades of Grey. But I privately messaged Chris to give him my special message, which he shared in the following episode, which was episode 19, Black Girl Magic is Real, when he had another guest, Mr. Dan Gunther, who runs the podcast Positively Trek, as his guest. I'm going to play the clip that I mentioned from early on from episode 19.
Okay, so our final comment comes from James Duce again, but they left this comment with regards to last week's episode, Forget Me Not. And then they asked me if I would read this on this episode because it would mean a lot to them. So James says, I came out of the closet as a demisexual, non-binary person, and well, this episode that aired made me want to cry. Again, that's Forget Me Not, last week's episode. If it wasn't for this episode and a character like Adira Tall, I don't know if I would have had the strength to come out. I have always looked towards the Trill as acceptance for the community, never realizing until recently that I was looking at them as part of acceptance for myself. So, James, I am so honored that you shared this with us, and I'm so proud of you for having the guts and the bravery to stand up and say who you are, realize who you are, and of course, identifying with the Trill makes complete sense, and Star Trek in general. So this just really warms my heart so much, and I think you're amazing, and congratulations. And you are so lucky that you're in a Star Trek community that is loving and accepting of all different kinds of people. So you're in the right place and you're among friends. So again, thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's so heartening to read this comment. And yeah, I can't remember the exact quote or how exactly it was said, but somebody said the world is so much more interesting when people realize who they are and share that with the world. And I think, yeah, the world is so much better when we not just accept, but like, as Gene Roddenberry said, celebrate the special differences between folks, this is beautiful. And I love that Star Trek plays a role in that process as well. So very moving. And thank you so much for this comment.
Yeah. We talk a lot about this kind of stuff on What the Future Holds too, because obviously it's me and Brandy, and we're both like super sensitive, and so I think this is just beautiful, and I can't really think of a better way to end the episode today. Except welcome again to the party, James, and thank you everybody for your thoughtful comments.
I want to thank Dan and Chris for their kind words. It's been a few months since this episode was recorded. As I've mentioned many times, I've remastered and re-recorded this episode. Today is the 8th of January 2021 as I record this. And the comments made me cry once again while I was just listening to this episode again. Anyways, if you're a fan of Star Trek Discovery, please give Chris's podcast a listen. And of course, I will encourage you to check out Open Channel Trek, as a special guest appears on that episode. Well, that special guest is me. And I'll be including episode 20 in our special feeds, and it will also be part of our Open Channel Trek. Be entitled Open Channel Trek. It's going to be our second episode of our Star Trek review podcast once I get it launched. If you want to get a hold of Chris or Dan, I'm gonna play the clip of how you can get a hold of them. So let's take a listen.
Dan, it's always great talking about Star Trek with you, and let our listeners know where they can find you. I'm sure that they all know, but go ahead anyway.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, of course, for having me on. I really do appreciate it. You can find me on my podcast is kind of the main thing that I do with Bruce Gibson, called Positively Trek. You can just find that wherever you get podcasts. We try to talk about Star Trek in a positive and uplifting manner. So, very, very similar to, I think, what you've got going on this show for sure.
Yeah.
And my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Kurtratz Productions, where I make videos about Star Trek mostly, some other stuff occasionally. But on Saturday evenings, we do the Unready Room, which is a live discussion of the latest episode of Discovery for as long as it's running. So that's a lot of fun. Hope you'll join us there. And you can find me on Twitter at Kurtratz, and that's just Star Trek backwards, KERTRATS.
You can join the Open Channel conversation on Twitter and Facebook by following us at Open Channel Trek, and by joining our listeners group on Facebook by typing The Nexus into the search field. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at CD Littlefield. Keep an eye out for my open channel conversation threads on Facebook and Twitter, which I will post every Thursday right before each new Star Trek episode drops. Thanks for listening to Open Channel. Channel open, standing by.
If you've been listening to our other episodes of Sci-Fi Haven, you would normally hear at this point in the episode, we talk about one of our many sponsors for our show. But today, I'm not going to ask you to support any sponsor of our show, or even support us here at Sci-Fi Haven. I'm going to ask that if you want to support anyone, I'm going to ask that you find a local LGBT organization, support them, even if it's $1 or $2. So please, do that for me. Okay? And from the bottom of my heart, I want to say thank you for you to listening to this very special episode of Sci-Fi Haven. Honestly, when I first started Sci-Fi Haven back in October, I never expected to be doing a coming out episode. But listening to the comments that Chris and Dan gave on Open Channel made me cry. I'm actually, you can't see my webcam, but I'm tearing up as I'm saying this. And well, it was time for me to come out to my podcast audience when I first came out, and I'm re-recording this, and all the emotions are still there. I'm sure you can tell in my voice. But at this time, I would love it if you would join us on our social media platforms. You can find us most active over on Twitter under the username sci-fi_haven, and we use the hashtag Sci-Fi Haven. But you can also find us on Facebook under the username Sci-Fi Haven, and our podcast is available on YouTube. Links to each of our social media platforms is included in our show notes and on our website, sci-fi-haven.ca. And I'm going to invite you to join our Facebook group, The Communicator. Granted, our Facebook group is not as big as Open Channel Trek's Facebook group, The Nexus. But I will hope that you will join us there, as we will post links to each of our shows so you can see what is coming up and what we have also had in the past. I want to thank you for listening. Live long and prosper.